Ben, thank you for being here with us. It's great to have you at the NASDAQ during this RSA week. Um, and congratulations on the successes you guys have been able to achieve at Chainguard. Um, I am super excited about this conversation because the problem that you guys are solving is one that I've dealt with in a number of my previous roles. So I'm glad to see that you and your company have decided to tackle this problem. And obviously, you guys are doing a great job at it. So in terms of background, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a couple of seconds, but you have worked on open source most of your career. You have been a developer, a maintainer, a founder of open source projects. Some of those projects are still being used by developers worldwide.
That's terrifying.
I know, isn't it crazy? So it's safe to say that you have a very good understanding of the open source ecosystem and the risks that also are associated with deploying open source. So in light of some of the events that we've seen the last couple of years, I'm thinking Log4j, XZ utils, attack, and so on. What is your perspective on, first of all, how the open source ecosystem has evolved and what we can do as an industry to better secure open source?
Sure. Yeah, there are a bunch of factors at play here when you look at the range of attacks, the range of vulnerabilities, the economic dynamics happening in open source all at the same time that make it a very convoluted space and a very messy problem. Open source isn't new. Open source has been around for decades and decades and decades. And it's reached a level of ubiquity that I think is relatively new for open source in general and the way that enterprises are consuming it, which is placing increased expectations on that open source code, coupled with immature consumption processes from enterprises around open source, which are kind of leading to this mismatch in expectations. You mentioned Log4Shell a couple of years ago. Right? That is a worst case scenario type software vulnerability. Open source is not insecure by any means, right? Open source is, by every metric, is more secure than proprietary software. There's more eyeballs, things get fixed faster, more experts can look at and review things, but all software has bugs. The software I write has bugs, the software you write has bugs. The more software there is, the more likely there's going to be bugs, and some bugs have security implications. And so this was really, Log4Shell was really a perfect storm in some ways of the most widely used library and the most widely used programming language. It was a latent bug for over 10 years before it was actually discovered, so it had a chance to be deployed in 10 years worth of infrastructure before this bug was found. It's the worst we've found so far. I doubt it's the worst we'll find ever. We'll probably find something worse in the future. But the problem that highlighted is really a lack of inventory management inside of companies. When you buy licensed software, you do a very good job tracking where that software is running because your bill goes up every time someone else runs that software. And so for licensing, for legal reasons, you pay very close attention to how much of that software you're using, and there's friction associated with it, which makes it hard to just spread everywhere. Open source doesn't have that friction. Open source comes with open source licenses. It's free to use anywhere for any reason by any company. And that's great for developers. They pull in that open source very quickly. They grab it as dependencies. They grab it on their laptops. And then within seconds, it can be running in production. And you don't have to go through a procurement team. But the downside of that is that nobody's paying careful attention to what open source and which versions and which things they're using where. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum was the attack you mentioned, XZ utils. That's one that keeps me up at night, right? A malicious maintainer or someone intentionally inserting malware into code, completely different from Log4Shell, right? Where this stuff was just introduced by accident and eventually was discovered. We don't really have any good answer for that as an industry today. And if you're a nation state out there, I've said for years, you'd be incompetent to not have 3 or 4 developers out there just working on open source and building up trust and building up reputations over time to then flip that switch. Buying something that already exists, taking over a project like we saw in XZ, or even scarier, just starting a new project. If you just gave 3 people 40 hours a week to go try to build a fun open source project in some space, you could have 10,000 GitHub stars in a few weeks and it would be deployed everywhere. And you don't even need to switch maintainers at that point. And you could just insert malware whenever you want. These things are hard to discover and there's no real cost associated with the attack. We still don't know who the person was. It was a fake name on the internet. They get to go try it again somewhere. and two completely different problems and all rolled into one. And then it gets lumped into this messy sustainability argument where companies are using it for free and not paying back. And there's this kind of trope that if for some reason companies paid money for open source, all of the security problems would go away, which also doesn't work in practice. And so it's a complicated area, I guess.
Yeah. Awesome. So as the founder of a company that now deals with enterprise accounts, tell me about some of the surprising either statements or practices that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. I'm actually interested in that.
Oh, well, one of my favorite ones when doing enterprise sales is, negotiating MSAs, legal agreements from all these companies. Our product is, we basically securely package and build and manage and maintain and patch open source software. We have a large catalog of open source software. Companies tell us which packages they want. We give them our versions of it, which are hardened and secured. But in probably about 50% of the license negotiations with large enterprise accounts, there's a clause that so that they want us to warrant that there's no open source software used in the solution, and they're buying open source software from us, so we can't really make that guarantee. And I think that's a bit of a holdover from the period when there was a lot of FUD and marketing from proprietary vendors that open source is insecure, or if you use open source you'll get sued. Those kind of older messages that were kind of big in the 90s that we've kind of hopefully gotten past, but they're still little vestigial clauses in enterprise contracts.
Those are really hard to get rid of. Little bit of a hypothetical question. If you were to wave a magic wand and change a practice or a belief in how open source is being used and deployed, what would that be?
I think one of the biggest ones from a security perspective is memory safety. We have memory safe programming languages now that can be run in any application. And we've had memory safe programming languages for a while, but only recently have they really been able to meet the performance and size and characteristics to really run inside embedded or low level or operating system contexts. But every study, every piece of data, every piece of research on it shows that they work and they eliminate 90+% of all critical software vulnerabilities being found today. Things like memory issues, buffer overflows, stack overflows, memory corruption issues. They're a huge proportion of the software vulnerabilities, and they're an even bigger proportion of the critical ones. Things like Heartbleed were all memory safety issues. And it's 30 to 40 years worth of code that has to get rewritten. But we know that if we do that, we'll eliminate or reduce vulnerabilities by a factor of 10. And now we can do that. If I could just wave a magic wand, it would be to rewrite all that software in a memory safe programming language and let us focus on more trickier, newer vulnerabilities that are harder to manage.
Got it. So this is RSA week, RSA 2024 specifically, and I don't think I've had a single conversation that didn't mention or turned into an AI.
We made it pretty far in this one, though. Actually, I'm not surprised.
But a lot of those conversations, I guess I can distill them into a couple of vectors. One is that AI is helping attackers be more effective through things like exploit developments, optimizing their attack tools and so on. On the flip side, AI is enabling the security team to be better by helping with automation, mitigating the risk of human error that leads to incidents and so on. So I'm curious at Chainguard how you guys are thinking about integrating AI into your workflows, and how do you think it's going to impact the open source ecosystem as a whole going forward?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with the open source angle. I think a lot of projects are already starting to see a rise in these spammy AI generated contributions. Sort of tying back to that XZ threat model, everyone's on the lookout now for somebody with a brand new GitHub account throwing code that spooks everyone's radar now because they think they're going to be the next victim of something like this. And so people are trying to build up reputations over longer periods of time by sending lots of contributions to lots of projects. And we've seen AI being used to make that easier, just fixing typos, sending random grammatical changes across lots of projects. So it looks like your GitHub activity is up and you've been around for a long time, which is a lot of noise that maintainers have to deal with. We're seeing that in open source. We're seeing a lot of open source AI projects. We're seeing you can't talk about open source without talking about AI either. We're using a lot for automation internally. It's not perfect, but our approach to automation is that if we can fix 80 to 90% of things with automation, let humans focus on the hard 10 or 20%, then that's still a huge win for us. We don't need things to be perfect. So we have experimenting with some of the newer AI models to generate functional or integration or end-to-end tests, which are pretty easy to do by reading the README of a project, reading all of their bash scripts that they do testing with, and then transforming it into something we can run to make sure we don't regress over time. The credits are expensive, but they're a lot cheaper than people, and then people can kind of jump in and tweak the boilerplate after it's all been spit out. We throw compiler errors at it when we're debugging something and it used to build and it doesn't build anymore. We throw the compiler errors at it and have it just leave a suggestion for how to fix it. It's a lot faster than Googling for obscure error messages or warnings, but definitely leaning into using it just to speed up humans.
Yeah. That's the best thing about having a technical founder. Obviously, you've done this as a practitioner, as a developer, and so on. So, yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing you guys continue to grow and be successful. So, staying on RSA, what are some of the discussions you've been having or you're interested in actually having with the industry practitioners this week?
The AI discussions have been interesting, right? It feels still early. A lot of people want to talk about AI, but nobody's really using it yet. So all those discussions seem kind of early, but I am interested just to hear which people are actually using it. Even this morning, the number of hands that went up when people asked how they were using it, if they were using it in production yet, was still relatively low given the amount of dialogue around it. But people know the technology is here. I took a Waymo yesterday, right? AI is real and it can really solve things. Beyond AI, though, a lot of our discussions have been around some of the broader policy discussions happening in, say, Washington and Europe, and changing the regulations around software, changing the regulations around liability and the way people consume software, which is always a hot topic in the CISO community.
Like it. So pivoting a little bit, you have been prolific on LinkedIn. You've been posting on a lot of things.
I don't use AI for that, actually. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. But you've been posting on industry insights, the startup life, pretty much. From my perspective, things that are topics that are really interesting. I wonder if you can talk to us about your journey as a first-time founder.
Sure.
And specifically, any big lessons learned, any surprises, and so on. What would you like to share with the audience?
Sure. Yeah, lots. So we started about 2.5 years ago. It was just a handful of us. We're about 130 people today.
Wow.
The growth is a lot. I think one of the, especially as a remote company, one of the biggest lessons for us is just the importance of repetition. You can say something, you can share something once, but when you have 10 or 20% of the company joining each month, it doesn't matter how many times you told people a strategy or a plan or KPIs or OKRs, they weren't around to hear it the first time. And that growth coupled with being remote just really drives home the importance of frequent communication, repetition. You can't say things enough. Keep saying them until people start screaming for you to stop, because otherwise it didn't make it through.
My last question is a little bit of a catch-all. What advice do you have for organizations that are using open source software, and specifically around how to safely consume open source and elevate the posture of their software supply chain?
Sure. Yeah, the biggest one is just the way to think about it first. And I think that if you do this, then it'll help kind of flow to the rest of the way you manage open source. But there's always these terms like, is open source free as in beer? Is it free as in speech? Another kind of trope I've seen is that's free as in puppy. Right? When you adopt open source, yeah, it's free. But you have to take care of it. You have to have a plan to update it. You have to have a plan to monitor it. You have to have a plan to patch the vulnerabilities inside of it. And if you look at it that way, yeah, you might go to an RSA happy hour and drink a bunch of free beer. But if somebody were handing out free puppies, you probably wouldn't take 20, right? You know the care and feeding that comes with that when you bring it in. And so, yeah, it's free to grab the first time, but there really is a cost of ownership associated with it, and you need to think about that upfront. And that leads to more responsible open source and hopefully puppy adoption.
Well, great. Dan, I really enjoyed the conversation, the insights. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure.